I was still holding my champagne glass when my husband leaned close enough for me to smell the whiskey on his breath and said, "I'm done funding your pathetic lifestyle," like it was a punchline meant to entertain the room. And when I didn't laugh, he added louder, "It's time you start paying your own way, Isabella." And someone actually chuckled behind me while the soft jazz band kept playing like nothing had just broken in half, and I remember blinking at him, slow, steady, the way you do when you're trying to decide if you heard something wrong, but I hadn't. So I set my glass down on the marble counter, careful not to spill, and I said, "Okay, just that, one word," because anything more would have given him what he wanted, a reaction, a scene, something to point at later and say, "See? This is why," and he smirked like he'd just won something, like he'd been waiting for this moment. And when his colleague Mark asked, "Wait, you guys don't already split everything?" Daniel laughed, shrugged, and said, "I've been carrying us for years, man. Time to fix that." And I felt every eye in that kitchen shift toward me, measuring, judging, rewriting the story of who I was in real time. And I could have corrected him. I could have said, "That's not true." I could have listed the rent I paid when he was between jobs, the credit cards I quietly covered, the nights I stayed up recalculating budgets while he slept. But I didn't, because suddenly I understood something I hadn't wanted to see before, that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a narrative he had built about me, and he liked it, so I just nodded again, small, controlled, and said, "Then let's split everything." And that was the moment something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet click inside me that said I was done explaining myself to someone who had never really been listening in the first place. And if this story speaks to your heart, only if it truly resonates with you, take a second to like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now, because I always wonder who else is out there at this exact moment, feeling something similar and not saying it out loud. My name is Isabella Cruz. I'm 32 years old, and this was the night my marriage didn't explode. It simply revealed what it had already become, and to understand how we got there, you need to go back a few hours earlier, to the office where everything was supposed to feel like a victory, where my manager shook my hand and said, "Senior Director, Isabella, you earned this," and everyone clapped. And I smiled, polite, composed, while my phone buzzed with Daniel's text. So I guess I'm finally off the hook now. And I stared at it longer than I should have, reading it twice, because something about it felt off, like a joke that wasn't really a joke. And when I got home that evening, he was already in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone. And he didn't hug me, didn't ask how it went, just glanced up and said, "So how much more are you making now?" And I told him, simple, factual, and he let out a low whistle, shook his head and said, "Wow. Must be nice." But there was something under it, something tight, something I couldn't quite name, and I remember opening the fridge, staring at shelves I had stocked that morning, thinking this should feel like a celebration, and instead it felt like stepping into a conversation I hadn't agreed to have. And when I suggested we go out to dinner, just the two of us, he said, "Or we could invite people over. Might as well show off your big win." And the way he said show off made it sound like something cheap, something performative. And I told myself I was reading too much into it, that maybe he was just tired. Maybe this was his way of processing. So I said yes. I texted a few friends, I cooked, I set the table, I created the evening he would later use to humiliate me. And all night he made small comments that didn't quite land until you lined them up together. "Guess you're the breadwinner now. Don't forget about us little people. Maybe you can teach me how to get lucky like that." And every time someone laughed, I felt something tighten in my chest, not sharp, just steady, like pressure building. And when I finally said quietly, "It wasn't luck," he smiled at me in a way I hadn't seen before and said, "Relax, Is. It's not that serious." And that's when I realized it wasn't about the promotion at all. It was about control, about who got to define what my success meant. And later that night, after everyone left, after the dishes were stacked and the house was quiet, he sat across from me at the dining table and said, "We should separate finances. It's cleaner." And I asked, "Cleaner for who?" And he shrugged, leaned back, and said, "For both of us. You make your money, I make mine. No confusion." And I nodded again, the same calm, controlled nod, and said, "Okay." And he didn't notice the difference in my voice, didn't notice that I didn't ask questions, didn't argue, didn't try to negotiate, because he thought he had already won. And that was the problem, because there were things about me, about what I had been building quietly for years, that he had never once asked about, not out of respect, not out of curiosity, not even by accident. And as I sat there looking at him, I realized something that should have been obvious long ago, that the man across from me didn't actually know who I was anymore. Maybe he never really had, and the truth about that wouldn't come out in that moment. Not that night, but it was already there, sitting just beneath the surface, waiting for the right person to see it. And that person wasn't Daniel, not yet, because the first one to see it would be my mother. And when she did, she wouldn't just react, she would scream. I grew up in a house where silence meant you were doing something right, and being noticed usually meant you had done something wrong. And I learned that early, standing in the kitchen at 8 years old, while my father pointed at my report card and said, 92 is good. Isabella? But why not 100? And my brother Mateo leaned against the doorway with his arms crossed, grinning like he had already won something without trying, and my mother just kept stirring the pot on the stove, saying nothing, letting the moment settle the way it always did, heavy and quiet, like disappointment was part of the air we breathed. And I remember nodding, small, controlled, the same way I would years later, saying, I will do better, even though I had already done more than enough. And that became the pattern, not just at home, but everywhere, because Mateo could forget his homework, and my father would laugh and say, boys will be boys. But if I left a glass in the sink overnight, my mother would sigh and say, you need to be more responsible, Isabella. People notice these things. And I would stand there, staring at the glass like it had betrayed me, like it had said something about who I was that I could not argue with. And when I was 12, I saved up $50 from tutoring kids in our neighborhood and bought my own backpack because the one I had was falling apart. And when I showed it to my mother, she ran her hand over the fabric and said, you should not waste money on things you do not need. And I remember saying, but it is my money. And she looked at me then, really looked and said, in this family, we think about everyone, not just ourselves. And Mateo walked in behind me, tossing his brand new sneakers on the couch, sneakers my parents had bought him that same week, and no one said a word. And I learned something in that moment that I did not have the words for back then, that fairness was not something you could expect. It was something you quietly adjusted to, something you worked around, something you carried without making noise. And by the time I was 16, I had a part-time job at a small office downtown, answering phones, organizing files, doing whatever they needed, and my boss, Mrs. Green, would watch me work and say, you notice things other people miss, Isabella. And that was the first time anyone had said something like that to me. The first time it felt like being quiet was not a flaw but a skill. And I held on to that, I built on it, I learned how to read numbers, how to track patterns, how to anticipate problems before they happened, because if you could see what was coming, you could prepare for it, you could control it, at least a little. And when I met Daniel in my early 20s, he felt like the opposite of everything I had known. He was loud in the best way, confident, easy to talk to, the kind of person who walked into a room and made it feel lighter. And the first time he met my parents, he shook my father's hand and said, Sir, you raised an incredible daughter. And my father smiled in a way I had never seen before, a proud smile. And later that night he said to me, he is a good man, Isabella. And I remember thinking maybe this was what it felt like to finally be seen, not for what I could fix or carry or improve, but just for who I was. And in the beginning, Daniel did see me, or at least I believed he did. He would ask about my work, listen when I talked, tell me I was smart in a way that felt genuine. And when he struggled, when his job fell through and he spent months trying to figure out his next step, I stepped in without thinking. I paid the rent, covered the bills, told him, we will figure it out, the same way I had always told myself. And he would squeeze my hand and say, I do not know what I would do without you. And I believed that meant something permanent, something solid, something that would not shift the moment things changed. But looking back now, I can see the small moments I ignored. The way he would joke about me being too serious, the way he would interrupt when I talked about work, the way he stopped asking questions once things started going well for me. And I told myself it was normal, that relationships settle, that not everything needs to be explained, because that is what I had been taught, to adjust, to carry, to keep things running without making it look like work, and maybe that is why what happened that night did not come out of nowhere. Maybe it had been building for years, in ways I did not want to admit, and as I sat at that kitchen table after everyone left, watching Daniel scroll through his phone like nothing had changed, I felt something familiar settle in my chest. Not shock, not even anger yet, just that quiet, steady awareness that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and the difference this time was that I was no longer willing to adjust around it, not quietly, not anymore, because there was something about to surface, something I had kept separate for a long time, not out of secrecy, but out of habit. And once it did, everything Daniel thought he understood about me was going to change. The first time everything began to change, it did not feel dramatic. It felt quiet, almost invisible, like a door opening in a room no one else was paying attention to. And I remember sitting at my desk late on a Thursday evening, the office mostly empty, the soft hum of fluorescent lights above me, when my manager, Claire, stepped into my office and closed the door behind her, and that alone was unusual enough to make me sit up straighter, and she said, "Isabella, I have been watching how you handle the Westbridge account," and I nodded, careful, waiting, because I had learned not to assume praise meant anything until it was clearly stated, and she leaned forward slightly and added, "You see things before they happen. You solve problems before anyone else even notices them." And I felt something shift in my chest, something small but steady, and I said, "I just try to stay ahead." And she smiled in a way that felt real and said, "It is more than that, and we need someone like you at a higher level." And for a moment I just looked at her, processing, because no one had ever said something like that so directly to me before, and she continued, "There is a senior position opening up next quarter, and I want you to be ready for it." And I remember asking, "Ready how?" And she said, "Start thinking bigger, start owning the room, not just the work." And I nodded, but inside something was already moving, something that had been building quietly for years, finally being acknowledged out loud. And that night when I got home, I told Daniel, standing in the kitchen while he scrolled through his phone, and I said, "Claire thinks I should go for the senior role." And he looked up briefly and said, "That is good, I guess." Then went back to his screen, and I waited, thinking maybe he would say more, maybe ask questions, but he did not, so I added, "It would be a big step." And he shrugged and said, "Just do not let it go to your head." And I remember standing there, holding on to that moment, trying to decide if it mattered, if it meant anything. And I told myself it did not, that people react differently, that not everything needs to be celebrated out loud, but something about it stayed with me, something quiet and unresolved. And a few weeks later, when I got the official confirmation, when Claire called me into her office and said, "It is yours, Isabella. You earned it," I felt that same steady shift again, stronger this time, like something locking into place. And I called Daniel from the parking garage, my voice softer than I expected as I said, "I got it," and there was a pause on the line before he said, "Already?" And I said, "Yes." And he let out a short laugh and said, "Wow, you are moving fast." But there was something in his tone, something I could not quite name, and I said, "We should celebrate tonight." And he replied, "Sure, invite some people over." And that was how that night started, the one that would eventually unravel everything. But the tension did not begin there. It had already started to show in smaller ways, in comments that seemed harmless on their own, but felt different when you placed them side by side, like when we had dinner with his sister Elena a few days after my promotion, and she stirred her drink slowly and said, "So now you are the big boss?" with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. And I said, "Not exactly, just more responsibility." And she laughed lightly and said, "That sounds stressful. I would hate to bring work home like that." And Daniel added, "Yeah, she tends to overdo things." And I looked at him then, really looked, and said, "It is part of the job." And he shrugged like it was nothing, like it was all just casual conversation. And later that night, as we were leaving, Elena pulled him aside near the car, and I was close enough to hear her say quietly, "Just make sure she does not start thinking she is better than everyone else." And he laughed under his breath and said, "Trust me, I will handle it." And I stood there for a second longer than I should have, keys in my hand, pretending to check something in my bag, but really just listening, feeling something settle into place in a way that was hard to ignore. And when we got into the car, I asked, What did she mean by that? And he glanced at me briefly and said, "Nothing. You are overthinking it." And I turned my attention to the road ahead, watching the streetlights pass in steady intervals, telling myself again that it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. But the truth was already there, forming in small, quiet pieces, and over the next few weeks, as my role expanded, as I took on bigger responsibilities, stayed later at the office, handled decisions that carried real weight, I noticed the shift not just in Daniel, but in the space around me, the way conversations changed, the way certain questions stopped being asked, the way assumptions took their place instead. And one evening, as I sat at my desk reviewing numbers that did not match, numbers that hinted at something more complex beneath the surface, I realized that the changes in my life were not happening in isolation. They were triggering something else, something in Daniel, something in the people around him. And whatever that was, it was not finished revealing itself yet, because there was something coming, something I had not fully seen yet, but I could feel it building, steady and unavoidable, just beneath the surface. I did not realize how far it had spread until the first time someone repeated his words back to me, like they were facts instead of opinions. And it happened on a Friday afternoon in the office break room, when Mark from finance leaned against the counter beside me and said casually, "Daniel told me you have been stressed lately, trying to keep up with the new role and everything." And I turned to him slowly, coffee cup halfway to my lips, and asked, "Stressed how?" And he shrugged, like it was nothing important, like he was just passing along information, and said, "You know, adjusting, figuring things out," he said, "you have been overwhelmed." And I smiled, small and controlled, and said, "I am fine." But something inside me tightened, because I had never said that, not to Daniel, not to anyone. And later that evening when I got home, I found him in the living room, laptop open, typing quickly, and I stood there for a moment watching him before I said, "Why are you telling people I am overwhelmed?" And he did not even look up at first, just said, "I did not say that." And I stepped closer and said, "Mark repeated it to me today." And he sighed then, leaned back in his chair and said, "I was just explaining the situation, Isabella. You are taking on a lot. It is normal." And I asked, "So you tell people I cannot handle my job?" And he shook his head like I was missing the point and said, "I am helping them understand. It makes things easier for everyone." And I remember standing there, trying to follow the logic of that, trying to understand how turning me into someone fragile, someone struggling, somehow benefited me. And when I said, "It does not make anything easier for me," he gave me that look again, the one that felt more like dismissal than disagreement, and said, "You are overreacting." And that was the moment I realized this was not just a conversation, it was a strategy, something deliberate, something that had already been set in motion before I even noticed it. And over the next few days, I started to see it everywhere, in the way his sister Elena would call and say, "Daniel told me you have been working too much. You need to slow down before you burn out." And I would say, "I am not burning out." And she would respond, "That is exactly what someone who is burning out would say," and laugh lightly like it was a joke, but it was not. And in the way his mother would text me, "We are worried about you, dear. Daniel said you have not been yourself lately." And I would stare at the message, rereading it, trying to find where this version of me had come from, this version that was being passed around like a story everyone agreed on except me. And when I confronted him again, standing in the kitchen with my hands resting on the counter, I said, "You are telling people I am unstable." And he looked up at me calm, almost patient, and said, "I never used that word." And I replied, "You do not have to. You are implying it." And he shook his head, stood up slowly, and said, "I am protecting you, Isabella. You are under pressure. People need context." And I remember laughing then, not loudly, just once, because it sounded so reasonable when he said it, so measured, like he was the one being logical and I was the one being emotional. And that was how it worked, how it spread, not through obvious lies, but through small distortions that sounded believable, that people could accept without questioning. And the worst part was how easily they did, how quickly the narrative shifted around me, how conversations changed in subtle ways, colleagues offering help I had not asked for, asking if I was managing okay, lowering their expectations without saying it directly. And every time it happened, I felt that same quiet pressure build, not explosive, not dramatic, just steady, like something tightening around me. And one evening, As I sat in my office reviewing a proposal that should have been straightforward, I realized I was second-guessing decisions I would normally make without hesitation, not because I lacked confidence, but because I could feel the weight of how others now saw me, and that was when it hit me. This was not just about our marriage anymore. It was about my position, my credibility, my work, everything I had built, and when I got home that night, I found him sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone again, and I said, "You need to stop." And he looked up, expression neutral, and asked, "Stop what?" And I said, "Stop telling people I cannot handle my job." And he set his phone down then, slowly, and said, "I am not going to apologize for being honest." And I felt something shift inside me, sharper this time, more defined, and I said, "It is not honesty, it is manipulation." And he smiled, not wide, just enough to show he did not take that seriously, and said, "You really think I have that kind of influence?" And I held his gaze and said, "I think you know exactly what you are doing." And for a second, just a second, something flickered in his expression, something I could not fully read, before it disappeared, replaced by that same calm confidence. And he said, "You are making this bigger than it is." And maybe that was the moment everything finally became clear, because I realized he believed that. He believed I would keep adjusting, keep explaining, keep trying to fix something that was already being rewritten around me. And I stood there, looking at him, understanding that whatever this was, it was not going to resolve itself through conversation, not anymore. And the next morning, when I walked into the office and saw the way people looked at me, the slight hesitation, the careful tone, the unspoken assumptions, I knew something had already shifted beyond repair, and that was the moment everything began to collapse. Not loudly, not all at once, but in a way that made it impossible to ignore that the ground beneath me was no longer what it had been. The first thing I did was try to fix it the way I always had, quietly, carefully, without making it worse. And that started with a phone call I made from my car in the office parking garage, engine off, hands still on the steering wheel as I dialed Claire's number. And when she picked up, her voice was warm but measured. "Hey, Isabella, everything okay?" And I hesitated just long enough to hear the shift in her tone before I said, "I think there has been a misunderstanding about my workload." And she paused, then replied, "What do you mean?" And I forced my voice to stay steady as I said, "I have heard that there are concerns about me struggling with the role, and I want to clarify that I am fully on top of everything." And there was a silence on the other end that lasted a second too long before she said, "We can talk about it on Monday." Not dismissive, but not reassuring either. And when the call ended, I sat there for a moment staring at my reflection in the windshield, realizing that whatever had been said about me had already reached her, and it was not something I could undo with a single conversation. So I tried again, this time through email, sitting at my desk late that night, drafting a message I rewrote 3 times before sending, outlining my current projects, attaching performance metrics, including timelines and results, making everything clear, structured, undeniable. And when I finally hit send, I felt a brief sense of control return, like I had done something concrete, something that could anchor the truth in something tangible. But the reply I received the next morning was short, polite, and distant. "Thank you for the update, Isabella. Let us review everything in our next meeting." And I read it twice, then a third time, looking for something more, some sign that she believed me. But it was not there, just professionalism, just distance. And that was when I realized this was not just about information. It was about perception, and perception once formed does not shift easily, not even with facts. And that night I tried a different approach. I sat at the dining table across from Daniel, the same place where everything had started to unravel, and I said, "We need to talk." And he did not look up from his phone right away, just said, "About what?" And I replied, "About what you have been telling people." And he sighed, set the phone down slowly, and said, "We have already talked about this." And I shook my head and said, "No, we have not really." And I leaned forward slightly, my hands resting flat against the table as I said, "You are affecting my work, my reputation. You need to correct it." And he let out a short laugh, not loud, just enough to show he did not take that seriously, and said, "You are acting like I made some huge statement. I just shared concerns." And I said, "They are not real concerns, And he tilted his head slightly and said, "From your perspective," and that was the moment I felt the conversation slipping, the same way it always did, like trying to hold on to something that was already being pulled away. And I tried once more, softer this time. "Daniel, please, just tell them the truth." And he leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms and said, "I am not going to call people and say, 'Hey, by the way, my wife is actually perfect.' That would be ridiculous." And I stared at him, searching for something, anything that showed he understood what this was doing. But there was nothing there, just that same calm certainty. And over the next few days, I reached out to others, small conversations, careful corrections, moments where I would say, "I think there has been a misunderstanding." And they would respond with polite nods, sympathetic looks, phrases like, "We just want to support you." And every time, I felt the distance grow, not because they were being unkind, but because they had already decided who I was in this situation, and I was no longer the one defining it. And one evening, I even wrote a message to his sister Elena, something simple, measured, explaining that I was doing well, that there was no reason for concern. And when she replied, it was immediate and dismissive. "Daniel is just looking out for you. Do not make this into something it is not." And I read that message over and over, realizing that it did not matter what I said. The version of me they believed in was already more convincing than anything I could explain. And that was when I stopped, not suddenly, not dramatically, just a quiet decision to step back, because every attempt to fix it had only made it clearer that I was not being heard, not really. And that night, as I sat alone in the living room, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, I looked around at the space I had built, the life I had supported, and for the first time, I felt completely separate from it, not angry, not even hurt in the way I expected, just distant, like I was observing something that no longer belonged to me. And that was the moment I understood that whatever this was, whatever had been set in motion, I was now standing outside of it, and no one seemed to notice. The lowest point did not arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, like a quiet weight that made everything harder to move through, and I noticed it first in the mornings, when I would wake up before my alarm, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft, steady breathing beside me, and for a moment I would forget everything, just exist in that still space, and then it would come back, not as a sharp pain but as a realization, steady and unavoidable, that something in my life was no longer mine in the way it used to be. And one morning, I turned slightly and said, "Daniel," my voice softer than I intended, and he shifted but did not fully wake. And I said, "Do you still think I cannot handle my job?" And there was a pause before he answered, his voice thick with sleep. "I think you are under pressure." And I waited, expecting more, something that acknowledged me, but it did not come. And I said, "That is not what I asked." And he sighed then, turned onto his back and said, "Why are we doing this again?" And I stared at him in the dim light, trying to find something familiar in his expression, something that reminded me of who we used to be. But all I saw was distance, not cold, not cruel, just removed, like I had become something he observed rather than understood. And I turned away, pulling the blanket closer around me, not because I was cold, but because it felt like there was nothing else to hold on to in that moment. And over the next few days, the distance grew in ways that were almost invisible to anyone else. In the way conversations became shorter, more functional, in the way he stopped asking even basic questions, like what time I would be home or how my day had gone, and when I would offer information anyway, trying to maintain some sense of connection, he would respond with simple acknowledgments, "That is good," or "Okay," and then return to whatever he had been doing. And it was not dramatic. There were no arguments, no raised voices, just an absence of something that had once been there, something I could not replace on my own. And at work, the shift continued as well, not in overt ways, but in small adjustments that accumulated. Meetings where my input was acknowledged but not followed. Decisions that were delayed or reassigned. And one afternoon, Claire called me into her office again, her expression careful, and she said, "Isabella, we are going to redistribute a few of your responsibilities for now." And I asked, "Based on what?" And she hesitated just long enough for the answer to become clear before she said, "We want to make sure you are not overwhelmed." And I nodded, the same controlled nod, and said, "I understand," even though I did not really, because I knew I was not overwhelmed. I knew I was capable, but that did not seem to matter anymore. And when I left her office, I walked back to my desk slowly, aware of the way people glanced up as I passed, not openly curious, just aware. And I sat down, looking at the projects in front of me that no longer fully belonged to me. And for the first time, I felt something close to loss, not of the work itself, but of the recognition that had come with it, the quiet understanding that I had earned my place, and that understanding was now being replaced with something else, something less certain. And that evening, when I got home, the house was empty, Daniel's car not in the driveway, and I stood in the entryway for a moment longer than necessary, keys still in my hand, listening to the silence. And I realized I could not remember the last time I had felt truly comfortable there, not just physically, but emotionally. And I set my keys down, moved through the room slowly, noticing small things I had not paid attention to before. The way his things occupied space without intention, the way mine had been arranged carefully, deliberately, as if I had been trying to create balance in a place that no longer held it. And when he came home later that night, he walked in, set his bag down, and said, "You are still up?" And I looked at him and said, "They are taking some of my projects." And he paused, just briefly, then said, "Maybe that is a good thing." And I felt that quiet weight settle deeper, not because of what he said, but because of how easily he said it. And I replied, "It is not a good thing." And he shrugged, walked past me toward the kitchen, and said, "It is temporary." And I watched him go, realizing that whatever this was, whatever had been lost, he did not feel it the same way, not even close. And that was when the loneliness fully settled in, not as something loud or overwhelming, but as a steady absence of connection, of being seen, of being understood. And for a while, I stayed there, in that space, not trying to fix it, not trying to explain it, just acknowledging it for what it was. And over time, something else began to form beneath it, something quieter, something steadier, not hope exactly, but a shift in focus, a sense that if I could not change what was happening around me, I could change how I moved within it, and that realization did not solve anything immediately, but it marked the beginning of something different, something that did not rely on anyone else to exist. I stopped waiting for things to return to what they had been, because I finally understood they were not going to, and the first real change did not come from a big decision. It came from a small one. The morning I woke up before my alarm again, and instead of lying there thinking about everything I could not control, I got up, walked into the kitchen, made coffee, and opened my laptop before the sun was fully up, and the house was still quiet. And for the first time in weeks, the silence did not feel heavy. It felt useful, like space I could actually work with. And I pulled up the files I had kept separate for years, the ones tied to projects no one in my personal life had ever asked about, accounts that had never touched our joint finances, work that had grown slowly, deliberately, without needing recognition. And I started going through them one by one, not rushing, not trying to prove anything, just organizing, refining, understanding exactly what I had built. And later that morning at the office, when I walked in, I noticed the same glances, the same careful tone from people around me. But this time I did not adjust to it. I did not try to correct it. I just moved through it, sat at my desk, opened my work, and focused on what was still mine to control. And when Mark from finance stopped by and said, "If you need help with those numbers, just let me know," I looked up and said, "I appreciate it, but I have it handled." And my voice did not waver. And he hesitated for a second before nodding and saying, "Okay," like he was not used to hearing that from me. And later that day, during a meeting where I would normally hold back, I spoke up without overthinking it. That projection does not align with last quarter's trend. And when someone asked, "Are you sure?" I answered, "Yes," and explained it clearly, without rushing, without softening it, and for a moment the room went quiet, not uncomfortable, just attentive. And Claire glanced at me briefly before saying, "Let us revisit those numbers." And it was a small moment, but it mattered, because it was not about convincing them. It was about not stepping back from what I already knew. And that became the pattern over the next few weeks. Small, consistent actions that did not depend on anyone else's approval. Arriving earlier, staying focused, letting my work speak without trying to manage how it was perceived. And outside of work, I made similar adjustments, not dramatic changes, just shifts in how I moved through my own life. Like the evening I came home and Daniel was sitting in the living room, scrolling through his phone as usual, and he glanced up and said, "You are late." And I replied, "I had things to finish." And instead of explaining further, instead of filling the silence, I walked past him, set my bag down, and continued with my evening, and he watched me for a moment before saying, "You have been different lately." And I paused, just long enough to acknowledge the statement before I said, "I have been focused," and left it at that. And he did not push further, maybe because he was not sure what he would get if he did, and that uncertainty was new, and I could feel it in small ways, in the way he hesitated before making certain comments, in the way conversations did not follow the same patterns they used to, and I did not try to change that. I let it exist, because for the first time, I was not trying to maintain something that no longer felt stable, and one afternoon, as I sat in my office reviewing a set of numbers that had been flagged earlier in the quarter, I noticed something I had not paid attention to before, a pattern in the accounts I had been managing separately, something that had grown quietly over time, consistent, structured, intentional, and I leaned back in my chair, looking at the screen, realizing that what I had built outside of everything else was not just supplemental, it was significant. And when Claire stopped by later that day and said, "We need to talk about your current responsibilities," I looked at her and said, "Of course," my voice steady. And for the first time, I was not concerned about what that conversation would mean, because I knew there were parts of my life, parts of my work, that no longer depended on this environment to define them, and that realization changed something fundamental. Not outwardly, not in a way anyone could point to immediately, but internally, in the way I approached everything moving forward. And that was when I understood this was not just about recovering from what had been lost. It was about recognizing what had always been there, waiting. And as I closed my laptop that evening and gathered my things to leave, I had the distinct sense that whatever came next, it was not going to look anything like what anyone expected, including Daniel, and that for the first time in a long time was not something I needed to explain to anyone at all. I did not announce the shift when it happened, because it was not something I needed to prove out loud. It showed up in the details, in the way I walked into the office one Monday morning, wearing the same tailored navy blazer I had owned for years, but now paired with a badge that actually matched the role I had earned. Senior Director printed clearly beneath my name, and for a moment I stood at the entrance, adjusting the lanyard slightly, not out of nerves but out of awareness, because I could feel the difference in how I carried it, not as something I hoped people would accept, but as something that already belonged to me. And when I stepped into the hallway, conversations did not stop the way they used to. They shifted, people made space without realizing they were doing it. And when I entered the conference room later that morning, Claire was already there, reviewing notes, and she looked up and said, "Isabella, we are ready to start when you are." And it was a small sentence, but it landed differently, because she did not say when everyone is ready, she said when you are ready, and I nodded, set my folder down and said, "Let us begin." And throughout that meeting, I did not wait for permission to speak. I did not soften my input. I simply stated it, clearly and directly. We need to restructure this timeline, or we will miss the target. And when someone pushed back saying, "That might be too aggressive," I responded, "It is not aggressive, it is accurate," and explained it without hesitation. And the room adjusted around that, not because I demanded it, but because I did not step back from it. And after the meeting, as people filed out, Mark paused near the door and said, "You handled that well." And I looked at him and said, "I handled it the way it needed to be handled." And he nodded, like he understood something he had not before. And later that week, Claire called me into her office again. But this time, her tone was different, less careful, more direct. And she said, "We are reinstating the projects that were reassigned." And I asked, "Based on what?" And she met my gaze and said, "Based on performance." And I held that moment quietly, not reacting immediately, just letting it settle before I said, "Understood," and left it at that, because I did not need to revisit what had happened. I only needed to move forward from where I was now. And outside of work, the changes were just as clear, even if they were not acknowledged directly. Like the evening I came home and found Daniel in the kitchen, looking through the mail, and he glanced at me, then at the envelope in his hand and said, "What is this?" And I stepped closer, saw the letterhead, recognized it immediately, and said, "It is for me." And he held it for a second longer before handing it over, watching as I opened it, scanned the contents, and folded it back carefully. And he asked, "You are not going to explain?" And I looked at him steady and said, "It is work-related," and that was all. And he waited, like he expected more, like he expected me to fill the space the way I used to, but I did not, and he eventually looked away, set the rest of the mail down, and said nothing else. And that silence was different now, not empty, but defined, like something had shifted in how we existed in the same space. And a few days later, when his sister Elena called, her voice carrying that familiar tone of casual curiosity, she said, "Daniel mentioned things have been better for you at work." And I replied, "Things have been consistent." And she paused before saying, "Well, that is good. I guess everything worked out." And I said, "Everything is exactly where it needs to be." And there was a slight hesitation before she said, "Right," and ended the call shortly after, and I set my phone down, recognizing that the narrative had not been corrected. It had simply lost its momentum, replaced by something less certain, something that no longer fit as easily into the version of me they had accepted before. And that was enough, because I was no longer trying to control how they saw me, only how I moved forward. And one evening, as I stood in my office at home, reviewing the accounts I had built independently, I noticed the numbers again, the growth, the structure, the consistency, and I allowed myself to acknowledge it fully this time, not as something hidden, not as something secondary, but as something real, something that had existed alongside everything else without needing recognition. And as I closed the file and turned off the light, I realized how far things had shifted from where they started, from that night in the kitchen when everything had been reduced to a single sentence, a single assumption about who I was, and how quietly, steadily, that assumption had been replaced, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through action, through consistency, through refusing to step back from what I already knew to be true. And as I walked down the hallway, passing the living room where Daniel sat, the television casting a soft glow across the space, I understood that we were now standing in a different version of the same story, one where the outcome had not been declared yet, but the direction was already set. And that was when I thought back to that Sunday, the one that had not happened yet in this timeline but was already waiting. The lunch, the moment, the reaction that would finally bring everything into the open. And I knew that when it came, it would not be loud or chaotic the way people might expect. It would be simple, clear, and impossible to ignore. Sunday arrived without announcement, the kind of quiet morning that feels ordinary on the surface but carries something heavier underneath. And I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had to, but because I could feel the day waiting, steady and inevitable, and I moved through the house slowly, making coffee, setting the table, arranging everything the way I always did when my mother came over, plates aligned, glasses placed carefully, nothing out of place, because that was how I had been taught to prepare, not just for guests, but for moments that mattered. And when Daniel came into the kitchen, he glanced at the table and said, "You are going all out for lunch?" And I replied, "It is Sunday." And he nodded, like that explained everything, then added, "She does not need all this." And I looked at him briefly before saying, "I am not doing it because she needs it," and left it there, because explaining more would not change anything. And by the time my mother arrived, the house felt still, not tense exactly, just quiet in a way that made every small sound more noticeable. The click of the door opening, the soft echo of her footsteps as she walked in, her voice calling out, "Isabella?" And I stepped into the hallway and said, "In here." And when she saw me, she smiled, warm and familiar, and said, "You look tired." And I shook my head slightly and said, "I am fine." And she studied me for a second longer than usual before nodding and stepping further inside, and Daniel appeared behind me then, offering a polite greeting, "Good to see you," and she returned it with a measured smile, "You too." And for a moment, everything felt almost normal, like the version of our lives we had maintained for appearances, and we moved into the dining room, sat down, exchanged small talk, the kind that fills space without revealing anything real. And as the conversation continued, I noticed the way Daniel leaned back in his chair, relaxed, confident, like he believed the narrative he had created still held. And my mother asked casually, "How is work going?" And he answered before I could, "She has been under a lot of pressure." And I felt the words land in the space between us, familiar now, predictable, and my mother looked at me, her expression shifting slightly, and said, "Is that true?" And I met her gaze and said, "No," simple, direct, and she held my eyes for a moment before nodding slowly, like she understood more than she was saying, and Daniel let out a small laugh. She just does not like to admit when things are difficult, and I did not respond, not immediately, because this was not the moment for correction, not in the way he expected, and we continued eating, the conversation moving around us, but I could feel the tension building beneath it, not loud, not obvious, just present. And at one point, my mother stood up and said, "I'm going to grab some water." And I said, "It is in the kitchen." And she nodded, walking down the hallway, her steps steady. And for a second, I considered following her, saying something, explaining something, but I did not move. I stayed where I was, because I knew whatever needed to happen next would not come from explanation. It would come from something else entirely. And a few moments later, Daniel glanced toward the hallway and said, "She is taking her time." And I replied, "She knows where everything is." And he shrugged, turning his attention back to his plate, unaware of the shift that was already in motion. And then it happened. Not gradually, not quietly, but in a single, sharp moment that cut through the stillness of the house, a sound from down the hallway, my mother's voice, not raised in anger or confusion, but something else, something sharper, something that carried recognition and disbelief at the same time. And Daniel froze for a fraction of a second before pushing his chair back, saying, "What was that?" And I stood up slowly, my movements controlled, measured, as if I had already accepted what was coming, and he moved past me quickly, heading toward the hallway, calling out, "What happened?" And I followed at a steady pace, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward, because this was the moment everything had been building toward. And as we reached the doorway to my office, I could see my mother standing inside, her hands still resting against the edge of the desk, her eyes fixed on something in front of her, and Daniel stepped in beside her, his voice shifting, "What is going on?" And I stopped just outside the door, watching, waiting, as both of them looked at what had been there all along, something neither of them had ever thought to question, something that was about to change everything they believed they understood about me. And for a brief second, before either of them spoke again, the room held its breath. I stepped into the doorway just as Daniel moved closer to the desk, his voice lower now, uncertain in a way I had never heard before. "What is this?" And my mother did not answer immediately. She was still looking at the document spread across the surface, her fingers lightly touching the edge of a folder like she needed to confirm it was real. And when she finally spoke, her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, something sharp. "Isabella, what am I looking at?" And I walked in slowly, stopping just inside the room, not rushing to explain, not reaching for anything, just standing there and letting the moment settle. And Daniel picked up one of the papers, scanning it quickly before flipping to the next, his movements faster now, less controlled. "This does not make sense," he said almost to himself, and I replied, calm, steady, "It does." And he looked up at me then, really looked, like he was trying to match the person in front of him with the information in his hands, and said, "These accounts, these numbers, this is not." And he stopped, unable to finish the sentence. And my mother turned slightly toward me, her expression no longer confused, but focused. "You built this?" And I nodded once, "Yes." And she asked, "For how long?" And I answered, "Years." And Daniel let out a short breath, shaking his head. "No, that is not possible. You would have told me." And I met his gaze without moving. "You never asked." And the silence that followed was different from the ones before. Not empty, but full, like something had finally been acknowledged that could not be ignored or reshaped. And he set the papers down slowly, his voice quieter now. "This is separate from everything attention." I said yes, and he took a step back like he needed space to process it. "How much is this?" And I did not answer immediately, not because I was avoiding the question, but because the number itself was not the point. And I said instead, "Enough." And he let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "Enough for what?" And I held his gaze and said, "Enough that your version of things does not apply anymore." and my mother shifted slightly, her eyes moving between us, understanding forming in real time, and she said quietly, "Isabella, why did you not say anything?" And I looked at her, then back at the desk and said, "Because I did not need to." And Daniel's expression tightened. "You did not need to?" And I nodded, "No." And he ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the room before stopping again. "So all this time, when I was," and he stopped, the realization catching up with him, and I finished the sentence for him. "When you were telling people I could not handle things?" And he did not respond, but his silence was answer enough, and my mother took a slow breath, her voice softer now but still firm. "You let that happen?" And I said, "I did not let it happen, I just did not correct it the way he expected." And Daniel looked at me again, something sharper in his expression now. "You think this is some kind of game?" And I shook my head slightly. "No, I think this is clarity." And he stared at me, trying to find something familiar in my tone. Something he could push against, but there was nothing there that he could use. Nothing reactive, nothing defensive, just steady certainty. And he glanced back at the documents, then at me, and said, "You agreed to separate everything." And I nodded. "I did," and he let out a breath, almost a laugh but without humor. "So this," he gestured toward the desk, "this is included in that?" And I held his gaze, calm, unwavering, and said, "It always was." And that was the moment it fully landed. Not just what the numbers meant, not just what I had built, but what it meant for everything he had said, everything he had assumed, everything he had told other people about me. And the room went completely still, the kind of stillness that does not need to be filled because it already says everything. And my mother stepped back slightly, her hand lowering from the desk, her voice quiet but clear. "You underestimated her." And Daniel did not respond. He just stood there, looking at me in a way that was no longer confident, no longer certain, and for the first time, I could see it clearly. Not anger, not even regret yet, but something closer to realization. The kind that does not come with immediate words, and I did not move toward him, I did not soften the moment. I just stood there, letting it exist exactly as it was, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to adjust. And after a few seconds that felt longer than they were, he said quietly, almost to himself, "I did not know," and I replied, just as quietly, "That is the problem." And the weight of that settled into the room in a way that none of us could ignore, because it was not just about what he had missed, it was about what he had chosen not to see. And in that moment, everything shifted in a way that could not be undone. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like the air in the room had changed, and everyone was trying to adjust to it without acknowledging how different it felt. And my mother was the first to move, stepping back from the desk, her eyes still on me but softer now, more measured as she said, "You should have told me." And I looked at her, not defensive, not apologetic, just steady, and said, "You would have asked if you wanted to know." And she held my gaze for a moment before nodding slightly, like she understood more than she was ready to say out loud. And Daniel let out a breath behind me, his voice lower now, less certain. "So this is what you have been doing?" And I turned slightly toward him and said, "This is what I have been building." And he shook his head again, slower this time. "And you just kept it separate?" And I replied, "Yes." And he ran his hand across the back of his neck, pacing once more before stopping near the doorway, like he was not sure whether to stay or leave. And he said, "You made it look like," and stopped. And I finished the thought calmly, like I had less than I did. And he nodded faintly, and I said, "You decided that, and the weight of that settled between us in a way that could not be redirected." And my mother moved toward the chair near the desk, sitting down slowly, her posture straight but her expression thoughtful. "Isabella, this changes things." And I said, "It does not change anything that was already true." And she looked at me carefully, as if reevaluating not just the moment, but everything that had led up to it. And Daniel stepped closer again, his voice tightening slightly. "So what happens now?" And I met his eyes, calm, grounded, and said, "Now everything is separate." And he blinked, like he needed a second to process that. "You mean the accounts?" And I shook my head once. "Everything." And he stared at me, searching for something in my expression that suggested I was exaggerating. But there was nothing there, no hesitation, no uncertainty, just clarity. And he said, "That is not what I meant when I said that." And I replied, "It is what you asked for." And he let out a quiet breath, frustration beginning to surface beneath the confusion. "You are taking this too far." And I answered, "I am taking it exactly as far as it goes." And the room fell quiet again, not tense in the way it had been before, but defined, like boundaries had been drawn without needing to be explained in detail. And my mother shifted slightly in her chair, looking between us. "Daniel, you need to understand what you set in motion." And he did not respond right away, his focus still on me. I was trying to make things fair, and I said, "Fair does not come from assumptions." And he looked away briefly, then back at me. "So that is it? You are just done?" And I paused for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to say it clearly, without emotion clouding it. "I am done adjusting to something that does not reflect reality." And he exhaled slowly, like that answer was not the one he expected, and he said, "You could have just told me." And I held his gaze, steady, and said, "You did not ask." And there was nothing more to add to that, no explanation that would make it easier, no way to soften what had already been revealed. And my mother stood up then, moving closer to the desk again, her voice quieter now but firm. "This is not just about money." And I nodded. "It never was." And Daniel leaned back slightly against the doorframe, his arms crossing, his posture shifting into something more guarded. "So what do you want?" And I considered the question for a second before answering, "Clarity." And he frowned slightly. "Clarity about what?" And I said, "About where things actually stand." And he shook his head again, not fully disagreeing, just struggling to keep up with the pace of what was happening. And for a moment, none of us spoke, the weight of everything settling in different ways for each of us. And I could feel it, not as tension, but as something unresolved, something that had been exposed but not yet fully processed. And I stepped back from the doorway slightly, creating a small amount of space between us, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a natural one. And Daniel noticed it, his eyes following the movement, and he said quietly, "You are serious." And I replied, "I have been serious for a long time." And that was the moment it became clear that this was not something that would resolve in a single conversation, not something that could be fixed by revisiting the past or redefining intentions. It was something that would require each of us to decide what we were willing to acknowledge moving forward. And as I stood there, looking at both of them, I understood that while the truth had finally been revealed, the outcome of it was still unfolding, and none of us were fully prepared for what that would mean. I did not leave that room immediately after everything was said, because leaving would have made it feel like an ending, and what I understood in that moment was that it was not an ending. It was a shift, something quieter, something that did not need to be announced to be real. And over the next few weeks, nothing dramatic happened, no loud arguments, no final confrontation that closed the chapter in a way people expect. Instead, things changed in ways that were almost invisible to anyone outside of it. And that was the part that mattered most, because real change rarely looks like a moment. It looks like a series of small decisions made consistently over time. And I started with the simplest one. I separated everything exactly as we had agreed, not emotionally, not out of anger, but practically, clearly, line by line, account by account, bill by bill. And when Daniel asked one evening, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, "So this is really how you want it?" I looked at him and said, "This is how it already is." And he did not argue, not because he agreed, but because there was nothing left to push against. And that became the new rhythm. We moved through the same space with a different understanding, not hostile, not even cold, just defined, like two people who had finally stopped pretending they were still standing in the same place. And at work, things continued to stabilize, not perfectly, not instantly, but steadily. The projects returned fully, the conversations shifted back, not because anyone apologized or corrected themselves out loud, but because consistency has a way of restoring what noise tries to distort. And one afternoon, as I walked out of a meeting where my input was not just heard but followed without hesitation, I caught my reflection in the glass wall of the hallway, the badge still resting against my blazer, my name, my title, clear, visible, undeniable. And I paused for a second, not out of pride, but out of recognition, because I understood then that none of this had been about proving something to anyone else. It had been about not stepping away from myself, even when it would have been easier to shrink, to explain, to adjust, and that realization settled into me in a way that felt more like calm than victory. And at home, the space felt different too, quieter in a way that was not empty but intentional. And one evening, as I stood in my office, looking at the same desk where everything had been revealed, I picked up the folder that had started it all, the one my mother had seen, and for a moment I just held it, feeling the weight of it, not as something secret anymore, but as something fully acknowledged. And I placed it back down, not hidden, not displayed, just present, exactly where it belonged, and that felt like the final piece of it. Not the numbers, not the accounts, but the fact that I no longer needed to position any part of my life around someone else's understanding of it, and that is the part people do not always talk about, that growth does not come from being seen differently by others. It comes from no longer needing that in the first place. And if you are listening to this and you have ever felt like you had to shrink yourself to maintain peace or explain your worth to be accepted, I want you to know something that took me years to understand. Your value does not become real when someone else recognizes it. It is already real, even in silence, even when it is misunderstood, and the only thing that truly changes is whether you choose to stand in it or step away from it. And that choice is quieter than people expect. It does not always look like a declaration. Sometimes it looks like a boundary. Sometimes it looks like a decision. Sometimes it looks like letting someone believe what they need to believe while you continue building what you know to be true. And if there is one thing I would say to anyone who finds themselves in that space, it is this: protect your clarity, protect your work, protect your sense of self, not by fighting every misunderstanding, but by staying consistent in who you are. Because over time, that consistency speaks louder than any correction ever could. And if your intuition is telling you something is off, something is being misrepresented, something is not aligned, listen to that, because that quiet voice, the one that does not panic but simply notices, is often the most honest guide you have. And whether you call it instinct, or faith, or something greater than yourself, trust that it is there for a reason, guiding you towards something clearer, something more stable, something that does not require you to become smaller to fit into it. And I want to thank you for being here, for listening, for allowing this story to exist in a space where it might help someone else feel less alone in what they are going through, because that is the part that matters most. Not just what happened, but what it means for someone else who might be standing in a similar place right now, trying to decide whether to stay quiet or to stand firm. And my name is Isabella Cruz. I am 32 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this: never let someone else's limited understanding of you become the definition you live by. And if this story resonated with you in any way, I invite you to stay with us, to explore the other stories in this space, because sometimes the answers we are looking for are not found in one moment, but in the patterns we begin to recognize over time. And there are more stories waiting, more perspectives, more moments that might speak to something you have not fully put into words yet. So if you feel that, follow it, because you never know which story might be the one that helps you see your own more clearly.